which is, anyway, let's see. We got it on now. So do you think it would be different if it were written today, or do you just think it's too dramatic regardless of time frame, Ireland? What do you think?
I think you're right, as in it would be different if it was written today. Things are more open today, like conversations and such. Probably with the time frame it was written in, it seemed accurate to some people.
Okay. And that's I asked for an opinion, and that's what you gave. So, and that's yeah, it can be seen as too dramatic. Okay, somebody else, authority, talk to me about the author. What do we know about the author? Okay, anyone who's answered before can also go.
I can say something because it wasn't me, it was another member in my group. She did do a search on Mr. Coates. And we felt he wasn't a good authority because he's quite a prolific author. He's won awards. He's won the National Book Award. But his topic really is race relations. We found out he went to Howard University, but he didn't complete a degree. So we felt like that sort of like kind of lacked the necessary educational credentials to be sort of an authority by position on this topic. And I know, so I felt like he wasn't such a good authority by knowledge either, because like I didn't answer for accuracy, but I did went and check things, and yeah, I didn't find him very accurate. So to me, that kind of discredited him.
Excellent. Actually, him lacking specific expertise is very few students find that, and that's 100% accurate. So well done. I don't know whether Steph, you did it or your
no, I can't take credit for that discovery. I forget who was in my last group. I hope that person is here so they can say something, but
that was
yeah.
Tree.
Oh, Tree.
Okay. Good job. Yes, excellent. Good. Okay. Cassidy, you had your hand up.
When I saw the Twitter little sign at the bottom by the author, that kind of put me off right away, because Twitter's very opinionated and not always an educated and fairness opinion. It's usually very biased. So right away at the end of that, and when I saw the Twitter, I just kind of put all that information out.
So you judged the author by the Twitter insignia. Okay. Okay. We'll save that for after. We'll save that for the end of the chapter. That's an interesting observation, but I'm going to park it for end of the chapter discussion. It's going to be an interesting one. Okay. Somebody else. Objectivity. Was the article objective? I know we've beaten up on the article and the author. So, but still, was the article objective so far? What do people think? Anybody want to comment? How do you know an article is objective? How do we know an article is objective?
I did appreciate the fact that the author noted what was missing from the research and the presentation by the media, and what questions should have been asked or presented. Not that I necessarily agreed with the whole article, but I did like how he made reference to, I would have asked this question, or I would have made this relationship, which was not presented.
So he identified gaps in information, right? So, yes. Okay. One measure of objectivity is often accounting for opposing views in the article. Okay. If you look at the article, yes, he did identify missing questions and gaps, but do we, when he's commenting about the correlation of teenage sex lives and their school grades or whatever it is, does he present opposing opinions? And does he refer to sources presenting opposite opinions? And if the answer is no, then you have to start asking, is this coming from an objective viewpoint or from a prescriptive, subjective viewpoint? Okay. Cassidy?
Bottom of the article, in parentheses, it says, "I'm pretty sure this is a point many older adults will nod at, thinking, yep." Is that his opinion?
When he says, "I'm pretty sure," It is, right? So
Okay.
unless he's saying it has been demonstrated that, and then he puts the citation for something, he's not relying on evidence, he's presenting an opinion.
So I don't really like that part that much, just because that kind of, he's kind of generalizing that all older adults would think that.
Yeah, well, I mean, opinions are not an awful thing. Opinions are fine. You're allowed to reflect and have your opinions, even in, and this is not even an academic piece. But in terms of objectivity, does it affect? So I would say the article lacks objectivity. It comes from a singular perspective. So if you read it, there's just yes, he has identified gaps in information and questions that haven't been asked, but you don't see an opposing perspective. So even without knowing the area, it's quite obvious that there is a certain lack of objectivity in the article itself. Currency, how currency refers to how recent is the article. What year was the article published in? Anybody?
It was published in 2010, August of 2010.
How current is it? Within the past 10 years? No, it's beyond the past 10 years.
Well,
So
now we're in 2021, so
right.
just almost 11 years in August.
So I don't know. Do you think the information is current?
No.
Cassidy?
In my opinion, for currency, I would do like within the 5 years for me.
Especially with the topic that is, because these trends are changing so fast, right? Teenagers speak different languages in 5 years. The words they use, the lexicon, it's all different. So, talking about something even more complex, in 5 years we went from flip phones to smartphones in less than 3 years, right? So no TikTok to TikTok was essentially a 3-year, even less than 3-year period. Cassidy?
Or even just like dating apps in general.
Yeah, because there's not much you can do with a flip phone. I don't think you can swipe left, swipe right, or whatever it is. You can't do any of that. Okay, all right. Coverage, how broad, how extensive is it in covering the topic? Is it extensively covered? Like, for example, are they addressing, this is an American article, so are they addressing a lot of places, just a singular place? What's your sense from the article?
Well, I noticed that there were some points from England. I think there was one section where he talked about a survey in England, which I
Okay.
thought was interesting, but at the same time, I don't think it's relevant to America.
Yeah, it's just that there are patches of information, like you point out, Artika, but it's on the whole, it's not a comprehensive article. Okay, so typically, even with common articles, we can sit and evaluate if it's particularly important to us. Obviously, we don't have all the time in the world, and half of the time when we read stuff, it's just to be in touch with the information and not necessarily to evaluate. Hamilton in England. Thank you, Cassidy. Okay, moving forward. That's just the link, so we don't need to worry about that. So questions like when we read stuff, who sponsored the survey, who conducted it, what's the population being studied, and if we don't have all this information, we don't know how accurate it is. I'll give an example. Show of hands will do. You can all raise hands. How many of you agree with me? Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Okay. One.
I do.
Okay, well, we see Steph's hand up. We don't see anybody else's. You can do a virtual hand raise if you don't feel like turning on your camera. It's absolutely fine. Okay, very good. So we see a couple more hand raised. Mamina, Catherine. Okay. Now, thank you, everyone. So a lot of you. You can put your hand down if you like. Do you know where this came from? how we figured out it's important. Tree says it's important for her. Where did this come from? That breakfast? Where did it start to become public knowledge that breakfast is the most important part of the day? Do we know what the origin of that is?
I don't know where it started, but I know that I have this belief because, like, I've read a lot of articles associating, high protein breakfast with improved mental health. Sort of why I come to that opinion, and also just noticing my own experience. But I don't know where this began.
Alana says from advertisements. Cassidy.
I don't really know, but I would assume maybe when they did a little bit more research on like brain activity, not brain activity, but kind of more like you know what I mean? Kind of when they want to know more research on types of food and the activity on the brain and what's better and what's not better, kind of thing. I feel like that's when it would become more popular.
Okay. Now, I'm going to mess this up for everybody who believes breakfast is the best meal of the day, and that's scientifically accurate, and I apologize. So in the 70s, there was a massive push by the grain lobby to get people to consume more grain. And one of the ways that they could effectively do it is by sponsoring studies that focused on the improvement of mental health and concentration with early morning meals. So there was a lot of cherry-picked data, but it essentially demonstrated the fact that if you ate breakfast, your mental health would be very, very good. Now, it's not that breakfast is an important meal. Don't get me wrong. But it's if you actually look at subsequent data, the impact between someone who's calorifically pretty well situated and they don't eat breakfast, it makes no difference. It makes absolutely no difference. Okay, so a lot of the studies, you have to wonder who it is, and so because it was pushed by the grain lobby and Kellogg's had a big share in it, Kellogg's sponsored a lot of the studies, okay, that suggested breakfast is the most important food of the day. It may be true, but the problem with the fact that Kellogg sponsored it makes it a little bit tainted. Okay, it's similar to another study on a very different in the 60s. People started blaming saturated fat for everything. So lots of studies. Well, there's one big study, I think it was Polman, I can't remember the scientist's name. What he essentially showed that in countries that consume a lot of saturated fat, there are higher incidence of heart attacks and strokes. Okay, so he selectively picked Australia, Canada, United States, Chile, 4 or 5 different countries. He conveniently ignored the Inuit people, whose food is primarily fat and meat. He conveniently ignored the French cuisine, which also has a lot of saturated fat. He ignored Polish food, again, lots of saturated fat. So he cherry-picked data. And for the longest time in the US, and perhaps the world over, the idea was that fat is really bad for you. Fat could kill you. And more studies are now showing it's not dietary fat that leads to a lot of problems. It's actually the excess of carbohydrate, especially particularly glucose, that causes a lot of these problems and largely implicated in heart attacks and stroke. So you have to always question who is paying money for the study, whose interest is at heart. And in the last lecture, we spoke about the fact that knowledge is socially constructed. So if somebody pays to influence the construction of new knowledge so as to influence societal behavior, that becomes tainted information in a sense. Now, the problem is you can have perfectly good information, but it often makes you wonder as to who paid for this particular study to occur. So scientific research, of course, has many, many goals, and that's what we're talking about in this course. What scientific research does is its goal is to provide some form of an acceptable description or explanation for some aspect of the universe. Scientific research is also important to settle debates, okay? And in order to do that, what research must do is it basically must collect and analyze facts or evidence. The question is, what is a science? What do we know as a science? Is gerontology a science? What is a science? Do we know that? Do we understand what a science is? So science is any discipline that collects and evaluates measurables. So if it's gerontology, you're collecting opinions and you can evaluate opinions. Measurables doesn't necessarily mean numbers. If you have interviews, you're not getting numbers out of them. But what you are getting is you're getting measurables, you're getting themes that you can use. You can extrapolate using themes. You get perceptions, okay? And even though they aren't hard numbers that you have on a scale, they're still measurables. So that's why anytime you start to collect information, start to evaluate information, and try to come up with a theory to explain it, that becomes a science. So obviously, even though I have my sociology friends and gerontology friends say, oh, we're not a science. Of course you're a science. You're doing research, you're studying stuff, you're evaluating stuff all the time, and you're comparing apples to apples, hopefully not apples to oranges. So it is a science. So gerontology is a science. Every field where you're going in, reading, collecting, evaluating is a science. Your scales may look different. They may be non-numerical. It does not mean it's not a science. Okay, so what I typically like to do at the end of, we will go on to the next lecture because we have time now. I believe we're at 11:55. We have good solid hour. But before we do anything else, I'm just going to stop share for a second. And we're going to go, if you have your textbooks with you, what I like to do typically is whenever I finish a chapter in the textbook, I like to go to the back and answer all the questions that are there. So we are preparing as we go along and no one is stressed out by exam time. So if you have your textbooks with you, go to the end of chapter 1 and let's try to answer those questions. My textbook is en route to me. Cassidy, I will read the questions out for everybody. So we will all be in good shape. All right. Okay. So question number 1, when is research carried out? What are the different circumstances in which research is carried out? Tree?
Whenever we have a question that we want to have answered, but we don't have it handy.
Okay, we don't have responses or we don't have an answer to a question, so we research to find out what the answer could be. Great response. Okay, anybody else? What are other reasons? Go, Cassidy.
Filling some sort of gap between.
Yep, and that correlates well with Tree said, filling a knowledge gap. What other circumstances would we want to do research? Go ahead. Sorry, Cassidy?
Maybe like when you're trying to figure out a diagnosis or figure out if a medication is proper.
Okay, so there's you're not sure of some information, so you go try to find it out.
What about making an informed decision?
Yeah, so again, that's again an extension of what Tree and Cassidy said. In order to help you make an informed decision, yeah, you do research 100%. What about if two people are both experts and they're having a debate? You know, if you read online, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And then your professor in class tells you, well, it might be, but it might not be. Okay, exactly. Momina says to settle a debate. Exactly. So now I've given you have two opposing points of view. And now you have to make a decision. Well, is breakfast truly the most important part of the day or is it not? So that's when you go and research, okay, to settle debates. Oftentimes we also do research to make a decision for practice, right? This is one of the things one of you just said. If you are attempting, you have a certain type of patient with a particular behavioral challenge and nobody has a solution. Nobody knows what to do because you haven't encountered it before. Well, lo and behold, you are all trained to do some research. You go hop on to your computer and you start searching, looking for other evidence that's out there. So there are many reasons to carry out research, and these are some of them. Question number 2. In what ways is the expertise of an authority limited? Steph, you can go first.
Okay, sure. Like when the authority in question may not be an expert in the realm being considered. Secondly, it can happen that two authorities in the same field disagree. So then there's a difficult decision, who do you defer to? And also authorities, you know, so there's something in the text about they're human and may not be able to provide assured answers. Like there's still limits to their knowledge. I guess that's what that's saying.
Yeah.
And in new realms, there's no authorities yet.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you all to think outside the box. Those are great answers, and that's what's there in chapter 1 of your textbook. What's another situation in which you wouldn't trust an authority? Teresa.
We just talked about sponsors. So if someone
Yes.
is influenced by money, by their sponsor, then we might have to question their authority on the topic.
So if Dr. Atlas, Trump's right-hand person, tells everybody to drink bleach to fix coronavirus, we do not believe him. Okay, so that's the, whether it's for money or whether it's for power. It's even when there's an expert, sometimes you have to ask who is behind the expert. Is it unbiased research or not? Great answers, everybody. I think the next question is almost an extension of what we asked. It says, discuss some of the problems involved in consulting authorities in order to answer questions. So that's what we did. Who would you consult about child raising techniques? How to raise a child? Who would we ask? Who might be an expert? We typically go to our parents, but who might be an expert? They are in some ways.
Maybe a psychologist, child psychologist, someone who kind of has some expertise in developmental psychology, specifically for that age group, like for younger children.
Momina's a certified person. Cassidy?
Well, I'm thinking more like within like the beginning stages of the development. So a lot of times, you know, a lot of parents can't breastfeed properly, so there's specialists specifically to help figure out that component so that they don't have to do formula.
Yeah, so there are lactation consultants who will come in and help the mom and the child, you know, successfully work breastfeeding through. We have Artika, then Tree.
I was gonna say social workers, but I guess it ties in with I think a response one of the classmates said.
I mean, this is a challenging question because, you know, there's a very personal component to child raising, right? It's very close, very intimate, and it's almost instinctive to go to your parents unless there's a strong reason not to, right? Oftentimes people will go to their friends who have recently had children than even their parents because their parents are a little outdated and not current. So people will often go to their friends. And who are the experts? In a sense, the expertise is shared. So that's a little bit more of a complex question. Cassidy?
I would say parents aren't always experts because they're definitely biased. So they definitely, I would say, like, throughout their generations would give out opinions based on gender or other types of things. So I wouldn't necessarily want to go for ask an opinion from a other mother per se all the time. I would consider what they say, but I would consider it in all directions.
Okay. So just stuff to think about, okay? Who would you consult about the impact of explicitly violent television on the play routines of children? Tree?
Personally, I would go online and look for papers that talk about that topic. That's just my personal opinion. I don't know that I would be confident in reaching out to other parents and see what they think, because there's such a wide variety of opinions. So I like, that's just my personal preference. I would go and see what researchers have found so far.
That's actually a very good answer. With the skill set that you have now, that's what you should do. If you have the wisdom of the universe at your hands, why ask for less? So there's a lot of sensibility in that. Jessica says, psychologists, recent peer-reviewed studies research to look at explicitly violent television and how it impacts the play routine, because the idea, the fear is that children will be very violent in play, and that's the suggested implication of the situation, right? So Jessica, I thank you for that opinion. And literature review, Cassidy says, so this is all coming from students who are very well acquainted, or at least have a sense for research and science. And that's good that everybody is thinking of those. So we have a whole bunch of responses, right? Consult the internet, consult an expert like a psychologist, look at literature, peer-reviewed stuff, and stuff. Okay, that's great. Okay, so the question 4. Okay. Let's have a little bit of a shout out to authorities we regularly consult. So there are going to be a couple follow-up questions to every answer that's given. So whoever starts will ask a couple follow-ups. An authority that you consult on a regular basis. Tree, and then Cassidy.
I regularly consult more experienced workers in my workplace.
Okay, the follow-up might be easy, but go ahead and answer anyway. How do you know that they know?
Well, the truth is through observation more than anything, because there are some that have been working there longer even, that I've noticed that some of their decisions aren't quite the way that I would, that others do better. So I think you just, one way is through observation.
Okay, so you're using a skill that you've developed over the years to decide who is an authority and why they're an expert. Okay, so I guess it's almost an extrapolation of the previous answer. What characteristics of these authorities are important to you?
So for me, they're efficient in what they do. They explain things very well when I ask them questions. That's very important to me. I guess those would be the main things.
Okay, so I can say with full confidence that gender, age, and social position have nothing to do with your decision to consult these authorities.
No.
Fantastic, good. Cassidy and then Steph. Who do you consult?
My closest cousin, who is more like my older sister, she's just became a family doctor, so I consult her probably on a regular basis a lot.
Okay, how do you know that they know? It can be a very simple answer because they are a physician, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Well, I studied with her, so I've witnessed what she's done and how serious she takes a lot of opinions. So she doesn't just take one opinion, she has to look at multiple other views so that she can come up with her own opinion first. So I like that about her.
So you know her very personally to know that there's a broad spectrum of things she considers. Okay, I won't do any more follow-ups because we have 3 more raised hands, so we'll get their word in quickly. Steph, who do you consult often?
I'm a client of a counseling social worker.
Okay.
So I would say I would talk to her about once a week.
Okay, and how do you know that she knows? Is it the qualification alone, or?
I do assign a lot of weight, perhaps too much weight, to a person's educational credentials. So I do know her schooling background, but also like I look at things like the fact that she continues to keep herself updated to, a new and emerging knowledge. And you know, also I've sort of been in a professional relationship with this person for like over 5 years now, and so I have this experience of having kind of applied her suggestions and have them work really well. So she's sort of proven herself that way.
Okay, so in a sense, you know she's an authority because not just because of her educational background, but your experience with working with this
Yes.
person. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steph. I think Artika's next, and then Momina.
I said family physician. I think it ties in with Cassidy.
Okay, same reasons.
Yeah.
Educational background and experienced skill.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think Momina said family physician as well.
I said that, and there was actually like I actually also work at a nursing home, so there are a couple of nurses like RNs that I do ask, and like I think I rely more on them than I do on the RPNs. Maybe it's just because of their role, or just because they'd have more knowledge, maybe. But I do prefer an RN over an RPN when it comes to like getting information about something specific.
Okay, so you have a preference based on what you perceive to be a certain educational skill set for the RN versus the RPN.
Yeah, and the family doctor, of course.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. I think we have one more. Jessica said my boss, and that makes me curious. Jessica.
Yeah, I consult my boss quite often if I come into something I'm unsure of, or if I don't know the policies, the way I'm supposed to do things, I'll often consult her and reach out to her.
Okay, okay.
I work at Bayshore. I'm an RPN.
Okay, so you consult your boss because they have a skill set that helps you out. Okay,
Yes.
very good. Okay, last question, and then we move on to chapter 2. Is it possible to live without accepting the word of authorities? Everybody that thinks yes, do a virtual hand raise. Everybody that thinks no, obviously don't raise your hand. Can we live without authorities?
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that question means? Because I'm not sure I really understand it.
Well, it is intentionally vague, and that's how it's worded in the textbook. But let's put it this way. Let me rephrase that. If you were to not take the word of authorities at all, would you be able to trust what you know? Okay, I'm going to try to answer this because I don't know what the author of the textbook intended with this question. So we'll go with the best answer. Cassidy says, no, I feel like it would make society crazy. Momina says, no. Anybody else have an opinion in the chat box? Depending on the experience is what Ilana says to everybody. Yeah, you know what it is to have no authorities at all would just be a whole bunch of opinions from different people. Let's assume there were no experts at all, right? Then you just have opinions, and opinions would form knowledge, and you'd have groups of people with different opinions, and essentially every community, because you can make up whatever rules you like, and there's no real expert, would have their own sets of rules. And some may, well, Cassidy says, right, so I don't know. We don't know. But yeah, in the end, we do need experts who contextualize social knowledge. Yep, Carly, you're right. Says because authorities guide us and confirm our opinions. Steph says, no, it's already too late to start living off the grid, so to speak. We already have been conditioned from birth to the influence of authorities. We can rely on them. So there is a role for authorities. Authorities do a lot of things. There's a lot of community-produced knowledge. Authorities weigh in and give credence to one thing or the other. So it's important. Okay, so go ahead if there are any additional questions. I'm working with an older textbook. My new textbook is in the mail, and it's been in the mail for 2 weeks. So I'm a little annoyed with the publisher. It's almost like he doesn't want me to adopt his textbook for the course. But that being said, if you have any additional questions in chapter 1, go ahead, attempt to answer them. If you can't find an answer, send me an email and we'll try to work the answer out. Okay. Now, moving on to chapter 2, which is technically lecture 2. I'm just going to give me 1 second while I get my iPad going on that. Okay. So one of the things that is different from this course in research literacy is we're actually going to understand how to do research. And we have to recognize that research is a process. And what I mean by that is, in general, any science, we agreed, we can definitely have some kind of agreement that gerontology itself, or any field that weighs, evaluates different things, is a science. Looking for an explanation, you do all of those things. And the goal of science or research is to have a generalizable explanation for something. The cool thing is, no matter who looks at it, they'll reach the same conclusions. As long as you go through the same steps, you're going to reach the same conclusion. And it doesn't matter whether you are an expert researcher or a novice. If you can follow the steps, it'll be fine. Part of doing research is to keep the process transparent. So what we're going to look at this lecture and the next is we're going to focus on the practical meaning of science. How does science produce knowledge? How is science supported by physical, tangible evidence, right? So in your textbook, there's an example of a man and a woman, or a boy and a girl. I don't know what, it's just names. So they are having a debate about diet and its role in high cholesterol, and they can't come to a conclusion. So they decide to obviously go ahead and do some research to figure out what that is. And research is a process, and what that basically means is that anything that's a process is a series of linked steps. So when you call anything a process, it's just a bunch of linked steps. And the steps occur in a certain manner. Experienced researchers will typically have their own style, depending on where they learned how to do their research. They'll have their own style going through the different steps. And the steps might look a little bit different from time to time, but the basic phases are pretty consistent. So the phases are, there are 3 phases in research. Phase 1 is to clarify the issue. Whatever the issue is, make it straightforward, explain the issue, okay, and have a straightforward answerable question. And in phase 1, you also select a method to be able to answer the question. Once you've done phase 1 has several steps. So this is just a very broad overview. Okay, so phase 1 is where you clarify the issue, you select a method, you do a bunch of different things, and we'll go into all of those things in detail in a little bit. Phase 2 is when you collect data. You actually start to do what you said you wanted to do, and you collect all the information. And the final phase is you process the data and you look at the evidence, relate the evidence to what your research question is, and you start to draw conclusions. And obviously you acknowledge limitations of your research, because your methodology might limit you to be able to do one thing or the other, and not everything, okay? All 3 phases are essential. It doesn't matter what research you're doing. It doesn't matter whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative. You have to go through all of these steps. And each one of these phases requires precision and effort on part of the researcher. It's particularly important that the research question, which is part of phase 1, is very, very focused. And it may not be that the research question will show an empirical relationship between two concepts. The relationship between two concepts is more of a hypothesis-based situation, more seen in quantitative research. Not necessarily that way, but the question needs to be very clear as to what's being asked. And the term empirical refers to measurable. Okay, so all research that deals with measurables is known as empirical research, okay, which we want to answer. Your measurables can be qualitative or quantitative. It really doesn't matter. In almost all cases, your research is guided by theory. So there's a theory that tries to explain something, and then you have data to prove it. It can be the opposite in qualitative, where you have the data as the result of a research question, and then you form a theory to explain the data, and that can also occur. So phase one, which is where you narrow and focus the question. Even though qualitative and quantitative research designs follow the same steps, there are differences, and we'll highlight these differences as we go along. But phase one has several steps, okay? So the first step is to select, formulate, and narrow the research question. So when let's try a simple example, why that's important. Let's say a higher education leads better career opportunities. Okay, does the sentence make sense to everybody? Okay, I have something in the chat window. I'm just going to open that up. Yes, perfect. Okay, now, okay, Arthika raises her hand. Arthika, go ahead.
I was gonna say, by higher education, do you mean like formal education? Because it could, you know, higher education can mean different things for different people.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a very important observation. So that's very, very good. Now, if we have to research this question, Arthika has identified a key problem. What's a higher education? We need to define this, right? Is a higher education an undergraduate degree? Is it a college diploma? Is it a master's degree? Is it a PhD? I don't know what a higher education is. That's poorly defined. What is better career opportunities? What does that even mean? Cassidy.
That's where I was going to go, was better career opportunities, because some people then even went to college or university at all. They just finished high school and they had many career opportunities, even more so than people who did have higher education. So I would want to know more how to link to both of them, like higher education with career opportunities.
So is it more money? Is it better benefits? Is it employment stability?
And what about like social hierarchy sometimes? Some people say that higher education, sometimes you would be on a higher hierarchy with social.
Right, and that's a different statement, and yes, and that's probably related as well. But the reason I pose this example is to draw all of your attention to the fact that the question needs to be narrow, because if I gave 4 of you this question to analyze, you could each choose a different definition of what a higher education means and a different definition of what better career opportunities mean, right? One of you might say, okay, if you have an undergraduate degree, okay, you're likely to make more money than somebody who does not. Somebody might say a better career opportunity would be a job that has better benefits, okay, and they both mean different things. For example, a physician makes a lot of money, but they don't necessarily have any benefits because they're a private business. They pay for their own benefits. The job doesn't come with benefits other than straight up cash. Some people might look at a unionized job, which doesn't pay much, as a better career opportunity than perhaps more money or even better benefits, you see? And the challenge here is the question isn't narrow enough, okay? A narrower question, for an example, would be individuals with a 4-year university degree are likely to earn a greater income than individuals who don't. And that's very specific because you can actually look at educational data and economic data that's available from Stats Canada, and you can actually research this topic. You can actually do it because the language is far more specific. And that's the whole idea. So once you have a very good question that you can research, then you can select the research design. You can start to measure you can determine what you're going to measure and what the measures are for the variables, things that change. You can set up your tables for analysis. You can choose a sample and so on. But all of these are part of phase one. One thing that I don't have set up here in phase one, which is also important, is ethics approval, particularly if you're working with human subjects, or even animal models for that matter. But as we go through phase one in detail in subsequent lectures, you'll recognize that we'll go through each of these sections in more detail. So I don't know, I just put a blank here. What is it like to be, I'm just going to say, but you could easily replace that with okay. And the reason I put out 3 different choices could be even more. To answer this kind of a question, what kind of research do you think we need? And I feel confident asking the class this question because you have some exposure to research methodology. What kind of research would it be if we wanted to answer a question of this type?
Qualitative?
100% correct. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather perceptions and perspectives, and numerical information is almost useless. And the opposite would be quantitative research. What percentage of Canadian families have significant disposable income? Now, this is not a very good question, and I noticed that right away. This is very clear. The words significant and disposable are very vague, okay? So one of the things, if you wanted to actually research the question of what significant is, what is significant disposable income? Is it a dollar amount? Is it a percentage of your income? That is something we have to define. And since that's not defined, it still makes it a poor research question. But despite it being a poor research question, it's quite obvious that the answer to this question is going to come from a quantitative methodology, okay? Again, if you wanted to study sleep deprivation and depression, you'd have to specify this question in far more detail. If you wanted to look at the experience of people being sleep deprived and how it was affecting their mental state, then that would become, oops, sorry, naughty. You could go a qualitative route here if you wanted to look at perceptions. And if you actually wanted to look at scores on depression scale that correlates to sleep deprivation, that would end up becoming a quantitative piece of research. You have to also remember that even though we have these so-called rigid boundaries between qualitative and quantitative, there's a lot of research that's done with a mixed methodology, using one method followed by the other, each one trying to support the other itself. So other than narrowing a question and focusing it, step 2 is to choose a research design. Okay, and this is the step in phase 1 where you make a decision. Okay, are we going qualitative or quantitative? And when we choose our research design, it completely depends on what question we want to ask. So for example, if you want to compare coronary heart diseases among women and their nutritional status, so this is you know, you're going to have some biographical information that the women are willing to share, and perhaps share what they consume if you're trying to correlate what they eat to the development of cardiovascular disease or the incidence of disease itself. It would, you know, then you would go ahead and have a quantitative design. If you wanted to look at their perception of recovery after going through a traumatic surgical procedure, then it would be an interview-based and qualitative design. So once you've chosen a research design, obviously you have to devise variables. What are you going to measure, right? And how will you measure it? So for example, if you're looking at incidences of heart design, incidence of heart attack or coronary disease or whatever it is, so how do you measure? How do you count or measure incidence of heart disease? So let's hypothetically say we're trying to match up people's dietary habits with, you know, trying to show causal effect of, say, nutrition and having or not having a heart episode. This is not meant to be absolutely logical. In the real world, we might not do an experiment like this, but let's hypothetically assume that is the case. So if you're attempting to measure presence or absence of a heart attack, how do we measure it? Give them a survey sheet and ask them to check a little box. Have you had a heart attack or a cardiovascular event? Yes, no, right? So that's your measuring instrument. That's how you measure that variable. And it is a dichotomous variable, yes or no. Sometimes you have something that's a variation. So when you look at weight loss situations and people say going on intermittent fasting and then the incidence of weight loss, you might have the weight loss itself. You might have different weight ranges that people might indicate that they lost depending on the length of time they engaged in intermittent fasting. Once you have all your data, once you have all your survey sheets, you have to have an analysis plan. What are you going to analyze? What are you looking for? So you have to define that. And unless you define that, it's not, you know, if you don't start with a good plan, you end up going nowhere. Then how are you going to present that data? You know, are you going to have it as tables? Are you going to have a graph? What kind of statistics are you going to do? And finally, you have to make a decision to sample. Do you want a representative sample? Is a representative sample important to answer the question you have in mind? Or is a convenient sample sufficient? Or do you need a very specific sample, such as a purposive sample? Okay, so there are many different types of samples, and we have a whole section, a whole lecture on samples itself. I think it's actually 2 lectures because there are so many sampling methods. Random sampling itself has so many sets and subsets to it, and then non-random is a different ballgame. And then there are mixed sampling methods too. So we'll talk about all that later. But anyway, let's look at a quantitative example. So let's say we wanted to study activity and optimal aging. This was what we really, really have our heart on to study, okay? Seeing that this topic, activity and optimal aging, what would our first steps be? Can we come up with a research question? So in order to come up with the research question, there are a few things we have to consider, okay? Is our study going to have both men and women? We have to make a decision. What's the geographic region? Are we going to limit our studies to a geographic region? And what's the plus or the minus for that? What's the advantage or disadvantage? What age group are we going to study? We have to define what activity means, right? We don't know what activity is. Activity could be anything. And what do we mean by optimal aging? What is optimal aging? Is someone who doesn't follow the rules of optimal aging suboptimally, or if someone's having better success than what's defined in an optimal aging setup, are they excelling? You know, these are all very vague concepts, so we need to kind of make a decision. So let's try to make a few decisions and try to make a nice research question out of this that can be answered. So let's make a decision. Will the study have both men and women? Yes or no? What do we want to do? What does the class want to do?
How about we study women?
Okay, so let's say we study women. Good. Okay, so we're now narrowing down our question. Excellent. What is the geographic region? Are we going to study all of Canada, all of Sudbury, all of Ontario? What are we going to do?
All of Sudbury?
And we're picking Sudbury. I know some of you are from out of town. Probably a lot of you are from out of town. We're picking Sudbury because if you are a researcher and you have to distribute surveys, you probably don't want to go very, very far. Okay, what age group?
65 to 75.
What do we mean by activity? Well, how do we want to define activity?
How about 150 minutes of moderate activity per week using a step counter, I guess?
Are any of those smart devices, eh? Well, we have to be very specific. So let's use step counter. So let's ask a very specific question using step counter. Okay, let's define optimal aging. What are we saying these people will accomplish if they do this activity? Are they going to What do you think? Is that reasonable? A greater score on quality of life scales? Or fewer medical visits? We have to pick one.
I like the quality of life one.
Okay. All right. So let's frame our question now. Let's frame our research question. So let's pretend that we have a hypothesis. We hypothesize that women over the age, or women 65 to 75, engaging in 150 minutes or more of activity per week. Will score greater than, and we have to pick a number. We don't know what the quality of life scales are depending on what scale you're using. Let's say its score goes from 0 to 100, and let's say good quality of a satisfaction quality of life scale, let's say good score is 75. We'll score greater than 75 on, we'll call this ABC quality of life scale because there's so many out there. Okay, so now this becomes a very researchable question. Women 65 or 75 engaging in 150 minutes or more of activity per week, we forgot the city. In the city of Greater Sudbury, will score greater than whatever number it is on the ABC quality of life scale. So all of a sudden, we went from something that's, we all understand what this means, but there's no actual way to measure it to actually get to something that's tangible. Sure, it's limited because we are limited to Sudbury. We are only measuring women. We are only measuring people who are walking. We're not measuring people perhaps who are squatting down to garden, which is also quite strenuous activity, especially if you spend 30, 40 minutes on your haunches, bending down, digging, all of those things. Or perhaps you're involved in some other activity which does not involve steps. But if you try to include everything, you end up usually answering nothing, which is why your question needs to be very defined, very focused. And once your phase 2 is data collection, and this is mock data, but if this was your table, and you're polling older adults, in this case, let's say older women, and let's say we magically have a scale called the perception of aging scale, okay? And we hand that scale out, so people who, apparently it has 3 scores, good, better, best. People who engage in 60 minutes of activity, very few of them actually feel very good about their aging. Oh, maybe this is the good one. Sorry, never mind. This is the good one. This is not the good one. Okay, so even at 60 minutes, you get a pretty high number. But if you look at percentages, that's about half. Again, still about half. But then when you start to go to 120 minutes or so, more than half end up feeling great. When you go to 150 minutes, 8 out of 9 feel great. So their perception of aging score is really, really high, which is number 1. This is made up data, so don't worry about it too much. But when you start collecting your data, you start to organize it, you might come to different conclusions based on what you find. Third phase is always analysis and interpretation. So, part of it is you have your data, you have your findings, so you draw conclusions from what you see. One of the important things you have to do is, it's great to draw conclusions, but is that what you set out to do in your research paper? Is that what you went out to ask? Because you don't want to start asking questions about optimal aging and activity, or activity and optimal aging, and then answer a question which says, yeah, people who typically do well in their aging perception eat better food. Because one thing has nothing to do with the other, and that's not what the question was for the study, okay? So you have to relate your findings to your research question and to the body of knowledge as a whole, which means not just to what you asked, but also to answer why it's important and what knowledge gap in literature have you actually addressed. Why did you start with this question? And you went about and answered it, and how does it help the bigger body of knowledge? Obviously, if you're doing a study in Sudbury just with women and looking at their activity level, there are limitations, right? It's geographically limited. It's limited by gender. It's limited by age. You're only looking at 65 to 75. It's limited by type of activity. It is limited by people that you have access to. It's limited by the devices you can distribute. So we have to think about all these limitations, and we have to remember that when we think of all these limitations, it prevents us from over exaggerating our findings. It keeps us rooted to what we actually see. And that's where future steps come in, because every study has limitations, and it should, because you're asking a limited question. You cannot have an unlimited answer. So once you know your limitations, then you decide future steps. Well, which limitation am I going to address in the next phase of the study? And that's the whole point of having limitations. Even if you don't address it as a researcher, somebody else following in after your work can look at your work and then decide what steps they wish to take. Okay. I think we have about 5 minutes left, and so we can do a little exercise. For this exercise, you're required to come up with a research topic, preferably one that interests you, and then specify how the topic can be rephrased as a problem statement. So this is quite complex to do in 5 minutes. So what I'm going to have the class do is very broad, not a specific research question. We will have, oops, I don't know my basic math. We'll have people talk about research topics, so things that interest you or you were curious about, but you do not know the answer yet. So this can be very broad, very vague. Our objective next class will be to narrow them down to researchable questions. So I am ready anytime you are. Cassidy says physical activity. Cassidy, what's your very broad question? What do you want to say? Physical activity and what?
I would say maybe physical activity and the benefits on older adults' mental health.
Okay, so we're just going to write broad topics today. On Monday, we'll break a couple of them down into answerable questions. Okay, next shout out. Anybody? Social network size and mental health. Oops. And she says older adults specifically, okay. Cassidy.
How about something to do with religion? Because normally older adults are spiritual in some sense, mostly with religion. So maybe how many individuals are still practicing religion, and
so what is the question you want to know? What do you want to ask, Cassidy?
I would like to figure out how, or how do I want to word this? If the number of older adults today are still, or the number of adults today practicing religion are still benefited by, I guess, by like their mental health. But I would want to know if the numbers are still accurate. Not accurate, but the same as previously.
So let's hypothesize that religious practice amongst older adults is not the same today as it was before. It's a hypothesis. We don't know if it's true or wrong, true or false.
sorry for the that was kind of difficult to...
No, research questions, well, these are not yet research questions yet, but it's when you think about how to answer a question, it's often hard to ask the question, and that's why we're doing this exercise. We have 2 more minutes. Anybody want to shout out the last one? And if nobody feels inclined, then I'll make something up. But immune systems amongst older adults. Okay, and then Jessica has, how many retired older adults are living below poverty? Okay. Greater than 65 live in poverty. And then we'll add a 5th question. It's a research question. Again, how do we improve immune systems? Older adults. Okay, very good. So we have some stuff to think about and how to make them researchable questions. I'm going to just take a very quick snapshot of this because it's very likely that I will lose this. So let's try this. Oh. Right. All right, let's try this one more time. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we'll use this for next class. Okay, very good. So we will stop now since we are at 12:50 and we don't have too many times for questions, but everybody keep your keep those gears going, and if any questions we'll address at the beginning of class next time. And other than that, have a wonderful weekend and we will see you all on Monday.
Thank you. Have a great weekend yourself.
Thanks, you too, Anita.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.